G'day, ladies and gentlemen. Thanks so much for joining us once again for the MMA edition of the Big Bad Brad Show. My name is Brad Williams, and every week we aim to provide you with news and views of the sport of MMA from way up the back in the cheap seats. And it's been a huge week since we last caught up, so let's jump straight into it. The first thing I want to clear up is a little bit of a mistake that I made last week when discussing the failed drug tests for Ken Shamrock and Kimbo Slice for their fights in Bellator MMA. My understanding was that they failed a drug test for their fight against each other at Bellator 138. That's not the case. They failed drug tests for their fights against, or Ken Shamrock for his fight against Royce Gracie, and Kimbo Slice for his fight against Data 5000, which was at Bellator 149. So, I got some bad intel. I didn't double check, and I do apologise. I don't want to lie to you by accident. I'll lie to you on purpose. I'll lie right to your face. But I will not lie to you by accident. And that's the truth. Something else that I just want to jump into from last week. A lot of people had some dramas downloading the show or listening to the show via the Facebook link at Big Bad Brad Show MMA on Facebook. I don't know how to fix it. I don't know what went wrong. I'm not tech savvy at all. I've got no idea with that sort of stuff. But the good news is the Twitter link seemed to be working just fine. So if you want to check out episode 2 from last week, you can do so. Twitter.com/Big Bad Brad MMA, or just search at Big Bad Brad MMA on Twitter, and you should be as right as rain. So as I say, it's been a huge week in the sport of MMA. The biggest story, of course, the legalization of mixed martial arts in the state of New York. It's the biggest MMA news story in quite some time, and we're going to get to that in just a little bit. But there's a few things we need to check out first. One that was a little bit of a surprise, a little bit of a shock, to be honest, was the fact that Ariel Helwani announced that he will no longer be working for Fox in the States, and therefore be no longer a part of UFC broadcasts. I think this is a huge blow for the UFC. I talked about Ariel Helwani last week. I had the pleasure of meeting him in Melbourne. He was such a terrific bloke. He really is, I think, the best MMA journalist in the world. There's nobody that covers the sport of mixed martial arts quite like Ariel Helwani. He's an absolute class act. And the rumours circulating online is that Fox let him go at the request of the UFC due to him breaking the story of a potential rematch between Nate Diaz and Conor McGregor at UFC 200. I really hope that's not the case. As a journalist, it's his job to break these kinds of stories, and if that is true, that's a real shame. But, Ariel Helwani's not hurting for work. He's got a great podcast, or radio show, I should say, that he does every week, the MMA Hour. You can check out at MMAfighting.com. He also does writing for the website. It's a really great website, MMAfighting.com, if you want to check it out. So Ariel will be nice and busy, and it'll be a shame not to see him on the UFC broadcast anymore. But you know where to find him if you do want to get his unique take on the sport of mixed martial arts. So jumping back into the story that Ariel was apparently attached to, and that was the news that broke this week, that Conor McGregor and Nate Diaz could potentially be having a rematch at UFC 200. This has been met pretty negatively, I would say, the news that this rematch could potentially take place. It's almost like the rematch no one asked for. Rumours were already starting to fly that Conor would be defending his featherweight title against Frankie Edgar at UFC 200. Nate Diaz had been linked to fights with Rafael Dos Anjos, Robbie Lawler, even GSP for people that wanted to get a little bit more excited with their predictions. So the news that the next fight for both men could be a rematch from UFC 196, it's it's not so much a letdown, but it just seems unnecessary. I mean, for starters, if Conor's next fight's going to be outside of the featherweight division, he really needs to look at potentially vacating that belt, or the UFC needs to maybe jump in and create an interim title. If Conor really has no plans to fight at featherweight again, then they should consider taking the belt off him. His coach, John Kavanagh, said that he would not be fighting at featherweight again. Conor then said, I will be fighting at featherweight. So, watch this space in regards to that. But you can't just kind of keep the division on hold. If he's got no immediate plans even to head back to featherweight, you can't just keep guys like Frankie Edgar, like Jose Aldo, like Chad Mendes, like Max Holloway. You can't just keep them waiting just in case Conor decides that maybe one day he might like to go back to featherweight. And it's also quite a head-scratcher because I don't really see what you're going to get by having that rematch. I mean, I think it could do more harm than good as far as Conor's concerned. 2 losses in a row is a lot to come back from, especially a superstar the caliber of Conor McGregor. It's just one of those things where if he beats Nate, good on you. If he doesn't, then that's exactly what happened last time. I don't know. I think the only thing I can really think of as to why the UFC would put on this fight would be so that Conor can get square with Nate, get his momentum back, and then maybe continue on to a fight with Frankie Edgar down the line. But as I say, 2 losses in a row, which could very realistically happen, is dangerous for a star the caliber of Conor McGregor. Nate Diaz did say on an appearance on UFC Tonight in the States during the week that if he does have the fight, he wants it to be at 155 pounds, in his words, so that Conor has no excuses next time he loses to him. I think that's probably a better thing for both men. Conor came in short of the welterweight limit, and in his words, he said he was eating all the time. He was eating 2 breakfasts a day just to try and make the welterweight limit. Nate, I think, looks his best at 155 pounds. If they are serious in putting together this rematch, then 155, I think, is the weight class that it should be contested in. But again, it just seems strange to slap this rematch together again. As I say, it feels like the rematch no one asked for. But, if nothing else, it'll be fun. And there'll be a lot of eyeballs on it. And UFC 200 is going to be a huge event. So stay tuned, because according to Conor McGregor himself, an announcement of his next fight could come as early as this coming week, I should say. And if it's anyone but Nate, then they've got us all hook, line and sinker, because the MMA media worldwide has been discussing this fight this week. Has pretty much been a lock. So, if it's not against Nate Diaz at UFC 200, you bloody got us, you cheeky buggers. Also news doing the rounds this week is a bit of great news for the UFC in the featherweight division. The Korean zombie Chan Sung-jung is hoping to make his UFC return towards the back end of this year, if not early 2017. He has been in his native South Korea, fulfilling his mandatory 2-year military service to the South Korean government. That ends in October, and he said that he's hoping to get a UFC fight in, if not the end of this year, the start of 2017. Korean Zombie is so much fun to watch. He is such an exciting fighter. He's just pedal to the metal, non-stop, in your face. Some of the greatest fights, both in the UFC and in the WEC, have featured the Korean Zombie. One of my favourite fights ever was his fight with Dustin Poirier in the UFC. His first fight with Leonard Garcia in the WEC, Joe Rogan called the craziest fight he's ever seen. Check it out if you get the chance. It's available on UFC Fight Pass. If you don't have Fight Pass, do get it. It's bloody unreal. It's only about $10 a month. It's got a great back catalogue of UFC fights, Strikeforce fights, WEC fights, Elite XC fights. You can watch Brace MMA from Australia, Shuto from Brazil, Pancrase from Japan. It's just unreal. Fight Pass. Get it. It's magic. So yeah, we could see the Korean Zombie back in the UFC octagon by the end of the year, which is very, very exciting news for the UFC featherweight division. Another story doing the rounds this week was the president of Rizin Fighting Federation in Japan coming out to squash rumours that Brock Lesnar was going to be returning to MMA to fight Fedor Emelianenko. Usually when someone comes out of nowhere to deny a rumour, it's a pretty strong sign that it is actually going to be taking place. But this one, I think it falls into the too good to be true category. The fact of the matter is, Brock Lesnar is contracted to the WWE. His contract doesn't expire until 2018. By then he'll be 40. He said himself that with his most recent WWE contract signing, he really had no interest in a return to MMA after that. The UFC apparently made a monster deal or a monster offer to get Brock to come back to the UFC when his contract expired with the WWE last year. In Brock's words, it was 10 times what he was originally offered when he came to the UFC, which is huge when you consider the money that he was making with pay-per-view points and things of that nature when he was in the UFC the first time. I think 2 of the 3 all-time pay-per-view buyers for a UFC fight featured Brock Lesnar. He really was just money for the UFC, so you can imagine why they were keen to get him back. But at this stage, he is in the WWE, and there's no way that they would let him take a fight with Fedor while he was still under contract. The WWE is struggling at the moment. The days of, Stone Cold Steve Austin and The Rock and 8 million viewers a week are long gone, and Brock Lesnar is one of the only genuine draws that they have left. So there's no way they would take a risk on him potentially getting injured and not being able to make money for them because they let him go and take an MMA fight with Fedor. As much as it would be a huge deal to finally see Brock fight Fedor all these years later. I think 2008 was when talk first started of Brock versus Fedor. So, 8 years later, they're still trying to put it together, and it really is one of the true super fights that really, it was the one that got away for a lot of people when Brock was a UFC heavyweight champion. Fedor was still considered the greatest heavyweight of all time and probably still is. So that fight would have been massive at the time, and even still, it kind of It falls a little bit more into that category of, well, better late than never. But yeah, as long as Brock Lesnar's under contract with the WWE, there's zero chance that he will fight Fedor Emelianenko, so we can probably write it off. So now it's time to move to the biggest MMA story of the week, and that was the legalization of mixed martial arts in the state of New York. And this has been a long time coming. It really has been the last kind of holdout as far as UFC and where they would like to host fights. I think it's fair to say they've probably been everywhere they would like to be or had hoped to be. Except for Madison Square Garden in New York City. The last time the UFC hosted an event in New York, they've only had one. It was in Buffalo, New York. It was all the way back in 1995. It was UFC 7, and it was a one-night tournament that was won by Marco Huas, the King of the Streets. What a great fight nickname, the King of the Streets. Oh, something. 19 years later, the UFC is hoping to have more than one event in New York in 2016, and that would be absolutely massive. They're talking about perhaps hosting events in other cities in New York before a Madison Square Garden show, whenever they do decide to do that. And the rumour is that the MSG show would be in November. It's going to be massive. The Madison Square Garden is the world's most famous arena. It's hosted some of the most famous, musical events, sporting events, anything that's anything has been at Madison Square Garden. The fight of the century between Muhammad Ali and Smoking Joe Frazier was at MSG back in 1971. It was the home of the first WrestleMania, with Hulk Hogan and Mr. T taking on Mr. Wonderful Paul Orndorff and Rowdy Roddy Piper. It would just be huge. It would be a huge event for the UFC, a great event for New York. And to host it in Madison Square Garden would be absolutely massive. So, congratulations to the UFC. Congratulations to the sport of mixed martial arts. It's now legal in New York, and they can officially get the good times rolling. So with that being said, that brings us to the end of the Big Bad Brad Show for this week. Thanks so much for tuning in. If you want to find us, and as long as I can fix the glitch that took place last week, you can check us out on Facebook at Big Bad Brad Show MMA on Twitter. The Facebook search is just Big Bad Brad Show MMA. You should have no dramas finding us. So thank you so much for tuning in. I really do appreciate the support, and I will catch you next time.